Well, I'm very pleased that we have Hank Greenberg here today. We've already talked about him and his career. Let me just reiterate it. It's the most amazing career. It starts when you landed on D-Day, right, on Omaha Beach. That's amazing. And at age 17, 18?
A little over 18 then.
And this goes way, and then participated in the liberation of Dachau at the end of World War II. And then, not to be stopped, was involved in the Korean War as well. And then took over an insurance company and made it into the most important insurance company in the world. And experienced a number of vicissitudes connected with that as well. So I was asking Mr. Greenberg if he would talk about what he did, how he made this enormous success, what kind of... we're interested in finance here, so it's something about how it was financed, but that, as we've been emphasizing in this course, it's more than just mathematical CAP-M modeling. It's about incentivizing people, about finding people with the right character, and I think that you can tell us about your experiences and what you've learned for so many years. So I'll turn over to you, and then we'll have we'll stop at around 10, and then we have time for a few questions from you.
A credit default swap originally was created so that if a security, in this case CDOs, which was really a product that was mostly real estate put together and packaged and sold as a CDO. Originally, those instruments had to have a default before a CDS, a credit default swap, would respond to that instrument that defaulted. Someplace along the line, that was changed so that the instrument didn't have to default. It simply had to lose value, and you had to put up collateral. The ones who issued the credit default swap had to put up collateral equal to what the loss of value, even though it wasn't realized, of what the CDO had lost in value. That change played a major role in what happened in the recession that we've just have gone through, particularly on Wall Street. Putting up more collateral meant you had to have a lot of cash on hand. No matter how big you were, it became a very important issue as to the ultimate demise of several companies, including the problems that AIG ran into. They were called on for billions and billions of dollars of collateral, which ultimately, I don't care how big you are, you run out of cash, which they did. One of the problems was in trying to determine what is the value of a CDO, since there was no price discovery, because there was no exchange in which you traded the CDOs on. That was, strangely enough, during the Clinton administration, the Treasury Department, then run by Bob Rubin, turned down the question of having an exchange and regulating credit default swaps. So you had a situation where every broker-dealer had a different price for a CDO. So what was how much collateral did you really need to put up if you couldn't tell what the price of one was? In this instance, Goldman Sachs had the lowest price of any CDOs that were being called on for collateral. And since AIG Financial Products did a great deal of business with Goldman Sachs, they were being called on for more and more collateral. They ran out of cash. Now, the insurance companies were all very, very solvent. They had, it's state regulated. You can't just take their capital for something else. They were protected. All the policyholders were protected under the fact that there was state law and not federal law that governed the insurance companies. But AIG ran into difficulties. I was not in the company. I would have handled it much differently had I been there. I would not have responded to the call for collateral when you couldn't tell what the price discovery really was. I would have said, you know, I should add one other thing. AIG was a AAA rated company when I was there. The day I left the company, it lost its AAA rating. So if you were AAA rated, you did not have to post collateral. If you were not AAA rated, you had to post collateral. So AIG ran out of cash. So they turned to the Fed for help. You got to remember, this is now at a time when Bear Stearns first got in trouble, and they found a buyer in J.P. Morgan, which really J.P. Morgan got Bear Stearns for nothing practically. There was 6 months in between Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. What did they do during that 6 months, the government that is, to prepare for any kind of financial upheaval? There was no plan to deal with what was about to descend in the financial markets in the United States. So Lehman Brothers, who could have been saved by the Fed, was let to go down, and that caused a run on virtually all the banks. The loss of confidence that ensued when Lehman Brothers was let go into bankruptcy startled the financial world, and everybody that had any money in any of the investment banks or banks was pulling money out. And so there was you couldn't borrow any money, the markets froze, and so there was an ad hoc approach to doing things. So Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, both of which were going to have a problem, were given a bank holding company license. That gave them access to the Fed window, and they could borrow money at virtually no cost at all, practical. The Hartford Insurance Company here in Hartford, medium-sized company, was also given a bank holding company license. And AIG was denied one. So AIG was left to really find a solution. So they went to the Fed, the New York Fed, which I had chaired, incidentally, for about 7 years before. So I knew the people in the Fed quite well. They borrowed $85 billion from the New York Fed at 14.5% interest. And the Fed took 79.9% of the equity of the company. So they essentially nationalized the company. Now the money that the AIG got, the $85 billion, at these terms was just outrageous. They then had to pay the CDOs that you couldn't tell what the real price was because there was no price discovery. You could have negotiated to the value of those at about 40 to 60 cents on the dollar, but the Fed made them pay 100 cents on the dollar. So AIG borrowed the money, paid Goldman Sachs and others 100 cents on the dollar, and had to pay that money back to the Fed. So things began to unravel very quickly after that. They obviously they lost credibility in the marketplace. They were losing business left and right. They had to pay back the government. So one thing led to another. The Treasury put in a man by the name of Ed Liddy to run the company. He'd be on nobody's list to succeed running AIG. He hadn't got a clue how to do that. And they began to sell off assets of AIG at prices that were just outrageous. So the outcome is that AIG is a shadow of what had been. The government now owns 92% of AIG. They want to sell that 92%. It'll take at least, in my view, 3 to 4 years, because it's an overhang. If they sell 10%, everybody knows there's another 80% to be sold, and so the stock will go no place. Do I feel bitter about it? Yes, I do. I feel very bitter about it. There was a desire in this country during the Clinton administration that housing should be an opportunity for everybody. Everybody should have the right to own a home. There wasn't much differentiation whether you can afford one or not. Historically in our country, mortgages were granted by local banks who knew the individual and would work with that individual if they got into any trouble. When the Clinton administration decided to expand housing, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were buying mortgages from these local banks, and the local banks would only service the mortgage, but they really didn't have any financial involvement after the mortgage was sold. And clearly many people got mortgages and homes that couldn't afford it. So that was one thing that was going to lead up to, ultimately, a problem. Second, investment banks in the United States were leveraging their capital 30 and 40 times the capital. That was outrageous. Going from, say, 5 and 6 times, or 7 times your capital, to 40 and 50 and 30 times your capital was obviously a risk that shouldn't have been taken. The SEC just ignored that fact. Why? It's hard to understand. But it was clear that we were setting in motion some conditions that would be very difficult to live with on a real-time basis. And of course, it was going to cause problems. Then some of these investment banks said, look, our job is to be creative and create products. So they took some of these mortgages that were being now written for people who didn't have really the right to own a home. They just didn't have the financial needs. They didn't have the financial background for it. They packaged these mortgages into a product. They took mortgages, they said, from the east, the west, the south, and the northeast, put them all together. They said the diversification is terrific, and that means you can have it'll be marked AAA. They went to the rating agencies and sold the rating agencies, Moody's and the rest, that this diversification, they deserve a AAA rating. And the rating agencies accommodated them. Didn't do very much analysis of their own, and they were marked AAA. And they sold these mortgages and these products, these CDOs, to every client and customer they could find all around the world. And of course, they weren't AAA. And then, as I said earlier, these credit default swaps that would respond to normally a default had been changed so that you responded to just a reduction in value. Just blew up in everybody's face. At the same time they were doing all of this, the Accounting Principles Board, located here in Connecticut, came out with mark-to-market accounting. Couldn't have picked a worse time to do that. And that marked balance sheets that you normally would carry, say, at cost or held to maturity where you keep the value. You had to mark it down to a market value. And that destroyed capital artificially in many instances. That never should have happened. SEC, who oversees that, kept silent. So you had all of these things come together at the same time that led to the destruction that took place. There are other things that happened. I can go through a list of them, but I don't think the real story of what truly occurred in our country has been fully recognized yet.